Thank you. It is 8:10. The Hate and Public Order Scotland Act, which comes into force today, criminalises threatening or abusive behaviour which is intended to stir up hatred based on certain characteristics, including age, disability, sexual orientation and transgender identity. It does not protect women against misogynistic attacks. The police say they'll investigate every complaint they receive, but they have no new resources, and Chief Superintendent Rob Hay from the Association of Scottish Police Superintendents said people could feel aggrieved if they're reported under the legislation and have their details recorded, even if they haven't committed a crime. He says there is a risk of damaging public trust in the police. We will discuss the bill with the Minister who is putting it into action, the Act indeed as it is now, and also with someone who opposes it. But first let's turn to James Cook, the BBC Scotland editor. James, fill us in on why we've got to where we are today. What was the purpose in introducing it in the first place, and what do its supporters say it will do?
Yes, good morning to you, Justin. The supporters of this, and we'll hear from one, as you say, in a moment, was simply to I think, make the country a more pleasant place, I think is the headline of what they're trying to achieve here. They say that hatred is a problem, prejudice is a problem, and it is a problem in terms of criminal behaviour. And they say that this new crime, and you've outlined it well there, Justin, in terms of what it means, stirring up hatred, and some of the protected characteristics. I'd throw in another one is religion that's also protected here. The maximum penalty is a prison sentence of 7 years. And a person commits an offence, according to the new Act, if they communicate material or behave in a manner that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening or abusive, with as assuming that the intention of the perpetrator is to stir up hatred based on one of those protected characteristics. You rightly point out that they do not include biological sex. The Scottish Government, in fairness, is consulting on a separate misogyny law. Some women's groups are unhappy that these haven't happened. These two laws haven't come in tandem, but they are consulting on a separate misogyny law, and they say that they will introduce that in due course. And one other note on the first part of this, the stirring up of hatred crime, it includes stirring up racial hatred, but that's actually been illegal in Great Britain since the 1980s. This just consolidates that into this offence. And then on the other half of the bill, there is discussion about aggravation of crime. So if you commit a crime and it's shown to be aggravated by prejudice, then you could get a stiffer sentence.
And are people in favour of the Act also saying that freedom of speech is protected? And if so, are they saying how?
Yes, that's right. And and there are specific provisions in the Act discussing freedom of speech, and they were not there in the original draft. There was a long and difficult process by which this bill became law, and it was passed originally in 2021, and then there was a gap while there was a lot of discussion about enforcement, which you've hinted at there, with the police having some concerns. But several amendments to the bill are included in it, and in what is now the Act, and they include, for example, it states that it is a defence for a person charged with stirring up hatred to show that their actions were reasonable. And in that context, there is a specific reference to the right of expression in Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to free expression, which includes protection for ideas that offend, shock, or disturb. So there's a debate about the interpretation of this law, and there's a debate about the precise wording, and I think that is a lot of what we're going to hear in the coming days, Justin, is about interpretation, and a lot of that is potentially going to fall on the police, who will essentially be having to decide what is acceptable speech and what tips over into prejudice or hatred.
James Cook, thank you very much for that. Let us turn first to Peter Tatchell, the human rights campaigner, who is on the line now. Peter Tatchell, good morning to you.
Good morning.
And I think some people will be surprised to find you on the side of this debate that you are, but you don't think much of this Act, is that right?
Well, no, I think the Act is well intended. It's a good thing to try and crack down on prejudice and hate. And certainly the final version of the Act is much better with the amendments than earlier drafts. So progress, yes. But there are concerns about so much of the Act does involve subjective interpretation. So many aspects or key aspects of the Act are not clearly defined. So there's no definition of hate. When it comes to aggravated offences, there's no definition of malice or ill will. Now, the caveat is that it all boils down to what a reasonable person would believe. But of course, reasonable people believe different things. And so there is a concern that the actual interpretation and enforcement of the Act may be clouded by subjective judgments.
Well, except that there is a right to offend, to shock and to disturb. Does that not protect most people in most modes of speech?
Well, one would think so. But just to give you an example, many times I've been arrested under the 1986 Public Order Act for behaviour that, quote, would cause harassment, alarm or distress. This legislation was originally intended to be brought in to tackle football hooliganism and violent street disorders. But since then, it's been almost entirely used against peaceful protesters, including myself. So, for example, some decades ago, I held up signs calling for gay law reform, and I was arrested because the police decided that calling for gay law reform in an era of public prejudice, that would result in harassment, alarm or distress. Now, I've never actually been convicted. I managed to defeat all those arrests, but there's an example of how the law can have unintended consequences or subsequently be used in a way that was different from its original intention.
What Hamza Yusuf, the First Minister, has said, if I have protection, he speaking personally, if I have protection against someone stirring up hatred because of my race, and that's been the case for some years, why on earth should these protections not exist for someone because of their sexuality or disability or their religion?
Oh, he's absolutely right. And as you've already mentioned, the big flaw in this bill is it does not protect women against hate. There is no protection against misogyny. And that is an astonishing exclusion because women, as we know, are victims of incredible levels of hate and harassment and so on.
Do you feel, as someone who's been deeply involved in these things for some time, are you saying that let us see what has happened and you fear about what might happen now as a result of the pressures that the police will be under? Or do you think that the entire Act is insufficient and ought to be rescinded?
No, the entire Act is basically okay, but there's this issue of interpretation. Another issue that is disturbing is that it will allow third-party reporting centres. So people can anonymously report a hate crime under this legislation. Now, in many cases, that would be entirely right and proper, but you can see that with anonymity being granted, this could open the door to vexatious and malicious complainants who will go after people and use the third-party centre as a way of getting back at people and put enormous pressure on the police for actually allegations or accusations that in many cases would turn out to be not true or would probably not even be accepted in the first instance if they had to be before a named identified officer.
Peter Tatchell, thank you very much. Let us turn to Siobhian Brown, who is the Scottish Government Minister for Victims and Community Safety, so is responsible for this legislation. Siobhian Brown, good morning to you.
Good morning, Justin.
Is misgendering a crime under this Act?
No, not misgendering, not at all, Justin. If I may, we respect everybody's freedom for expression, and nobody in our society should live in fear or be made to feel like they don't belong. So the Scottish Government's committed to building safer communities and living free from hatred and prejudice. And this is what this legislation that comes into place is all about. If I can, this is not a new piece of legislation. Stirring up racial hatred has been set in Scots law since 1986. And in England and Wales, there's been similar hate crime laws, which include stirring up hatred against race, religion, and sexual orientation in place since 2006 and 2008. So we are bring Scotland into line with England and Wales and adding other characteristics as well.
Yes, well, it's the adding of the characteristics. So you're taking Scotland out of line, aren't you, with the rest of the UK? And the reason I asked you about misgendering is that there are some people, including critics of J.K. Rowling, who say it should be including one former SNP councillor who said recently of J.K. Rowling she's not entitled to make people feel uncomfortable and to misgender someone. So just to be absolutely clear, if someone misgenders, in other words, calls a trans woman a man, online, a specific individual, you're saying that is not a crime in your view under this Act?
Justin, it would be a police matter for them to assess what happens, but I do need to reiterate.
Right. Sorry, just to be clear. So it would be something that someone could complain about, and there would be an investigation.
It could be reported, and it could be investigated. Whether or not the police would think it was criminal is up to Police Scotland for that. But this Act,
hang on, up to Police Scotland. So what would their decision-making process be?
But that would be an operational decision, Justin, and it would not be for me as minister to dictate what the police in an operation.
But they've had, so each police officer, not all of them have done it, but each police officer has had 2 hours online training. On the basis of that, you are saying it's up to them to decide.
They have had 2 hours training, but there's other things in place with Police Scotland. There's dedicated 24/7 lines for officers if they want to speak to anyone and get guidance on it. There's been a lot of training within the last year.
But does that training then tell them what it is that they need to base their decision on?
Yes, I believe so, because what has happened...
Right, so what is it?
Yeah, the Chief Constable last week, Justin, if I just may, did say that she was comfortable that the Police Scotland were ready to enact this legislation today, and that training was in place.
So what is it then that they will base their decision on? Is it intent? Is it a targeting of an individual? What is it?
Okay, there's a very high threshold which is in the Act, which would be up to Police Scotland, and what would have to be said online or in person would be threatening and abusive. If you are conveying a personal opinion that is challenging or offensive, for example, that would not be I would say would not
right.
be.
Well, look, that's very clear. So it has to be threatening to an individual. And of course, there are lots of threats made, for instance, against J.K. Rowling and against other women. But they don't come under the terms of this Act, do they? Which people, as Peter Thatcher was saying, is odd.
Well, I think it was considered when the legislation was going through in 2021, but I think more work needs to be done. And as you'll probably be aware, we are bringing through a misogyny bill.
But why does more work need to be done? Because you did think about it, didn't you? And you even had an amendment, and you arranged it with an SNP MP. Why is it not there?
Because we'll be going further for protection of women through our misogyny bill, which will be laid in Parliament, this parliamentary term.
But why didn't you just include them this time?
It was decided back in 2021 that more work needed to be done to protect women, and this is why we're having separate legislation.
No, but you didn't need to do it. Sorry, you didn't need to do any more work, did you? You've just made it very clear that under the terms of this Act, a specific threatening, abusive message to an individual, certainly to a trans individual, might well form the basis of a crime. But I'm saying to you, why didn't you also say that someone who believes in biological sex could also be included in that? And I'm not sure you've answered that, really.
If you're going on, Justin, about threats that are made on social media, there is already legislation in place through the Communications Act 2003, Section 127, that does make it a criminal offence if you have threatening behaviour online or you say something grossly offensive. That is not in this Act. What we are implementing today is, as you know, we're updating the legislation to include religion and sexual orientation, disability, age, and also against.
And what if it's not online? What if it's at home? So this issue has been raised that someone at home, a couple having a conversation, perhaps about trans issues, perhaps about something completely different that's covered in this Act, the child then reports them at one of these reporting centres. In other words, a conversation at home is reported. Is that remotely conceivable in your view?
No, I would not believe so. I think we're sort of this is getting all a little bit out of hand. This Act is being put into place to protect people of marginalised communities from threatening and abuse
Right.
of
So,
behaviour.
so it will not be as a result of a conversation in a home.
No, I do not believe so. And I understand that there's been a lot of concern about vexatious complaints. Potentially, the police Scotland, I've got faith in Police Scotland. They're used to implementing new legislation and also dealing with vexatious.
Okay. And a final point about geographical location. So if someone makes a comment that appears to break this law, but they're not in Scotland, what happens?
Well, this Act applies to Scotland, Justin.
Right, so someone can say these things in England and not be covered by it?
Well, you already have stirring up racial hate in England towards race, religion and sexual orientation.
Yeah, but say, for instance, there was a misgendering of someone in a way that seemed to the Scottish police to be threatening to that person, but the person making the misgendering comments were in England. What would happen?
Well, no, we're dealing with Scotland up here, Justin, and it would be up to the police in England or Wales to determine what would happen down there.
Okay. Siobhian Brown, Scottish Government Minister for Victims and Community Safety. Thank you very much.